Charleston, South Carolina, half past midnight. The moon hung low over the Ashley River like a judge's gavel suspended in the dark, waiting, watching, ready to fall. In the grand estate of Colonel Archibald Whitmore, where magnolia trees whispered secrets to the humid air and fireflies danced like the ghosts of stolen futures, a woman named Hannah stood in the kitchen with poison in her hands and rebellion in her heart. The silver spoons would clink at dawn, the masters would feast, and by noon, 6 men who owned her body but never her soul would be dead. This was not murder born of madness. This was mathematics, cold, precise, righteous arithmetic, written in arsenic and oleander root. For 17 years, Hannah had cooked their meals, birthed their children in secret shame, and buried her own daughter in unmarked soil after the mistress's jealousy turned to cruelty. The men at that table represented more than personal torment. They were architects of a system that devoured black bodies like sacrament, that wrote laws in blood and called it civilization. Colonel Whitmore, Judge Cornelius Drayton, Merchant Lord Samuel Hayward, Reverend Tobias Gadsden, Plantation Overseer Dutch Kraus, and Dr. Elias Pemberton, who used medical knowledge not to heal but to experiment on the enslaved. What Hannah did that night would not just end lives, it would light a fuse that burned through 3 colonies, inspired dozens of similar acts, and made the masters taste fear in every meal for a generation. Paragraph 3. The transition and first call. But before we descend into that blood-soaked dawn, before we watch empire choke on its own appetite, you need to understand how a cook becomes an executioner and how silence becomes a scream heard across an ocean. If you've ever wondered what it takes to turn obedience into annihilation, to transform a kitchen into a battlefield where the weapons are patience and powder measured by the pinch, then stay with this story, walk these shadow roads with me, and when you feel that chill of recognition crawl up your spine, let me know you're here. Drop a word below. Share this with someone who needs to know that history is not always written by victors. Sometimes it's written by the woman who cooked their last meal. Now, let us return to Charleston, to the kitchen, to Hannah. The kitchen was her kingdom and her cage, built separate from the main house, as all slave kitchens were. Lest fire consume the master's comfort, it stood like a confessional booth made of brick and iron, where Hannah had spent more hours than she'd spent sleeping in 17 years. The hearth was massive, large enough to roast whole pigs for the colonel's legendary gatherings, and tonight it glowed with banked coals that painted her face in shades of amber and shadow. Above her head, bundles of dried herbs hung from wooden beams, rosemary for the mutton, thyme for the venison, sage for the stuffing. And there, tucked behind the lavender that the mistress insisted upon for her headaches, were the other bundles, the ones with no culinary purpose. Oleander, harvested from the garden border where white flowers bloomed like innocent bells. Foxglove, whose purple trumpet sang songs of cardiac arrest, and in a small clay jar sealed with wax. Arsenic, purchased in careful increments over 2 years from a sympathetic apothecary's assistant, who asked no questions because he too wore invisible chains. Hannah's hands moved with the precision of ritual. She was 41 years old, though she looked 60. Slavery aged you in ways sunlight and sorrow alone could not explain. Her fingers were scarred from 1,000 kitchen burns, her back permanently curved from bending over cook fires, her eyes holding depths that no master ever bothered to see, because to see her would be to recognize her humanity, and that recognition would shatter the comfortable lie they lived inside. She wore a simple cotton shift, stained with years of grease and toil, and a head wrap the color of dried blood. Tonight, that head wrap felt like a crown. She had not always planned this. 17 years ago, when they dragged her from the auction block, young, terrified, still believing that obedience might earn mercy, she had imagined survival, not revolution. She had imagined perhaps kindness, perhaps eventual manumission if she served well enough, cooked perfectly enough, disappeared thoroughly enough into the role they demanded. That girl died slowly. What stood in the kitchen now was something else entirely, something the masters should have feared from the beginning. Her name had been Grace, Hannah's daughter. Born in this very kitchen on a January morning in 1769, delivered by Hannah's own hands because no midwife would come for a slave woman's labor, not when the mistress was hosting a tea party in the parlor and needed the appearance of civilized normalcy. Grace had her mother's eyes, dark as river stones, fierce as winter stars, and her father's smile, though Hannah never spoke his name aloud. He was a field hand, sold south 6 months before Grace drew her first breath, disappeared into the cotton fields of Georgia like a stone dropped into deep water. Grace had been bright, dangerously bright. By age 4, she could recite the Bible verses she heard the white children learning. By 5, she taught herself numbers by counting the silver pieces Hannah polished. The mistress, Eleanor Whitmore, had noticed. At first, Eleanor seemed charmed by the clever little girl who shadowed her mother in the kitchen, who brought flowers from the garden and curtsied with awkward grace. But charm in a white woman's heart was a candle flame, beautiful until threatened by wind, then capable of burning down everything. The threat came when Eleanor's own daughter, Catherine, 8 years old and spoiled as summer fruit, grew jealous of the attention. Or perhaps it was something darker. Perhaps Eleanor saw in Grace a mirror that reflected her husband's night visits to the kitchen quarters, reflected the truth that her marriage was theater and her household was built on violation. Whatever the reason, the cruelty began with small deprivations. Grace's food portions shrank. Her sleeping mat was moved to the coldest corner. Then came the beatings for imagined infractions. A glance held too long, a word spoken above a whisper, the crime of existing with intelligence in a body that was legally property. The final night came in August of 1773. Grace was 4 years old. She had reached for a piece of cake left on the kitchen table, a child's hunger, innocent and thoughtless. Eleanor found her. What happened next, Hannah refused to remember in daylight, but at night, in dreams, she still heard the sound of her daughter's small body hitting the floor. Still saw the fever that took her 3 days later, infection blooming from wounds that should have been treated but were instead ignored. Grace died calling for her mother. Hannah had been locked in the root cellar, punishment for trying to fetch the doctor. They let her out to bury the body. No coffin, no marker, just a shallow grave beneath the magnolia tree where Hannah now stood, grinding poison into powder with a mortar and pestle that had served 1,000 innocent meals. After Grace died, Hannah had considered drowning herself. The Ashley River called to her in the darkest hours, promising an end to the agony that woke her gasping each morning, the phantom weight of her daughter's absence crushing her chest like stones. She'd walked to the water's edge twice, stood with her feet in the mud where it met the current, felt the pull of oblivion like a lover's hand. But something had stopped her both times. Not hope, nothing so luminous as that, but a cold, clarifying rage that crystallized in her marrow and turned her spine to iron. Suicide would be a gift to them. They would replace her within a week, forget her name within a month, and the world would continue its terrible rotation as though she and Grace had never drawn breath. No, if she was going to leave this world, she would leave a scar they could never heal. The planning had taken 9 months, a gestation period for something monstrous and necessary. Hannah was not educated in letters, but she was literate in survival, fluent in the language of observation that every enslaved person learned or perished. She studied the master's routines with the attention of a general mapping enemy territory. Colonel Whitmore hosted a council meeting the third Tuesday of every month, gathering his circle of power to discuss politics, business, and the management of human cargo. 6 men, always the same 6, arriving at sundown and dining at 8. They trusted her, cooking implicitly. She'd been feeding them for 17 years without incident, her roasted duck and oyster stew legendary among Charleston's planter class. She noted everything. Judge Drayton preferred his wine heavily spiced, masking any bitterness. Merchant Hayward ate with the appetite of 3 men, hardly tasting what he shoveled down. Reverend Gadsden always prayed before meals, eyes closed for a full minute, thanking God for bounty built on stolen labor. Dutch Kraus, the overseer, drank himself half-blind before dinner even started. Dr. Pemberton, arrogant in his medical knowledge, never suspected that a slave woman might know as much about herbs and their effects as any university-trained physician, perhaps more because her knowledge came from necessity, from generations of whispered wisdom passed mother to daughter in the quarters where white doctors refused to tread. They arrived as the sun bled into the horizon, each man a monument to cruelty dressed in silk waistcoats and polished boots. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as their carriages rolled up the curved drive, horses snorting in the thick May heat, drivers, enslaved men whose names she knew, whose children played with grace once, helping the masters descend as though they were fragile treasures instead of architects of human misery. Colonel Whitmore greeted them at the door, his voice booming across the lawn with false joviality, the performance of Southern hospitality that coated violence in honey and called it civilization. Judge Cornelius Drayton came first, a man of 60 with a face like carved marble and a reputation for handing down sentences that separated families with the stroke of a pen. He'd once ruled that an enslaved mother had no legal right to her children, that they were property divisible like furniture in an estate settlement. 3 families shattered by that single decision, children sold to distant plantations while mothers screamed themselves hoarse. He removed his top hat and smoothed his silver hair, smiling. Samuel Hayward arrived next, the merchant prince whose ships brought human cargo from West Africa, packed so tightly that 1 in 3 died during the crossing and were dumped into the ocean like spoiled goods. He was fat with profit, his jowls quivering as he laughed at some joke Whitmore made, his rings catching firelight, gold purchased with blood and bone. He'd recently expanded his fleet, boasting at church that this year's imports would exceed 500 souls. Reverend Tobias Gadsden descended from his carriage with a Bible tucked under one arm, a man who preached on Sundays about the curse of Ham and the divine ordination of slavery, who told the enslaved that obedience to earthly masters was obedience to God, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. He'd personally blessed the whipping post behind his church, called it an instrument of correction and Christian love. Dutch Kraus stumbled slightly, already drunk, his face flushed and mean. He was the overseer of Whitmore's largest plantation, a man who measured his worth in scars delivered, who carried a cowhide whip like other men carried pocket watches and used it with the casual frequency of checking the time. Dr. Elias Pemberton arrived last, and Hannah's hands tightened on the kitchen windowsill until her knuckles went white. Of all the men gathering in the colonel's dining room, Pemberton was the one she hated with a purity that transcended rage and became something almost holy. He was young for their circle, 34, handsome in the way poisonous things often are, with dark hair slicked back and eyes the color of winter ice. He carried a leather medical bag everywhere, a prop in his performance as healer, but Hannah knew what was really inside. Instruments of torture disguised as science, notebooks filled with observations from experiments conducted on bodies that could not consent, could not refuse, could not escape. She'd heard the stories whispered in the quarters, testimonies that made even hardened field hands weep. Pemberton had a particular interest in pain tolerance, in studying how much agony the human body could endure before consciousness fled or death arrived as mercy. He conducted his research on the enslaved, who he claimed in medical journals, read at universities up north where men nodded thoughtfully and called it progress, felt pain differently than white people, that their nerve endings were less sensitive, their suffering less acute. This lie gave him permission for atrocities. He'd performed surgeries without anesthesia, removing tumors and resetting bones while patients screamed and were held down by other slaves threatened with punishment if they let go. He'd tested medications at toxic doses to observe effects, documenting convulsions and organ failure with detached fascination. 2 months ago, he'd come to Whitmore's estate to examine the slaves, a quarterly inspection to ensure the colonel's property remained profitable. He'd pulled a young woman named Sarah into the barn, claiming he needed to check her for signs of sickness. She'd emerged an hour later, unable to speak, trembling, blood on her thighs. When Hannah tried to comfort her, Sarah had only whispered, "He said it was for science. He said I should be grateful to contribute to medical knowledge." She'd hanged herself from the barn rafters 3 days later. Pemberton smiled as he entered the house, his teeth very white in the gathering darkness. Hannah smiled back from the kitchen window, an expression that never reached her eyes. "Tonight, Doctor, you'll contribute to knowledge. You'll learn what poison tastes like." The dining room glowed with candlelight, casting dancing shadows across walls papered in imported French silk, luxury purchased with the sale of human beings, beauty built on brutality. The table was already set, a masterpiece of silver and crystal that reflected fractured light like captured stars. Hannah had laid it herself that afternoon, each fork and knife positioned with the precision they demanded, each porcelain plate, hand-painted with scenes of English countryside that these men would never see, placed exactly 1 inch from the table's edge. The irony was not lost on her, she who owned nothing, not even her own body, arranging the possessions of men who owned everything, including her. The menu tonight was ambitious, designed to impress, to remind each man of Whitmore's wealth and sophistication. She would begin with oyster bisque, rich with cream and sherry, the brininess of the coast transformed into liquid gold, then turtle soup, a delicacy requiring hours of preparation, the meat tender and dark in a broth flavored with Madeira wine. The main course would be roasted duck glazed with blackberry reduction, accompanied by sweet potato casserole, collard greens cooked with ham hock, rice pilaf studded with pecans, and butter beans swimming in bacon fat. For dessert, she'd prepared bourbon pecan pie and syllabub, a frothy wine custard that the Colonel particularly loved. Every dish was perfect. Every dish was poisoned. Not all equally. That would be too obvious, too quick, too merciful. Hannah had learned patience from 17 years of swallowing rage, and she applied that patience now to her dosing. The bisque contained a careful measure of ground oleander root, enough to begin the process but not to raise immediate alarm. The turtle soup held slightly more, a escalation disguised by strong flavors. The duck, the centerpiece, carried the heaviest load, arsenic mixed into the blackberry glaze, indistinguishable from the natural bitterness of reduced fruit and wine. The side dishes were innocent. She needed the men to eat heavily, to fill their stomachs so the poison would work more slowly, more agonizingly. Only the dessert served last when it no longer mattered would be pure. She wanted them to die tasting sweetness, the final cruel joke. Hannah was not alone in this, though she would be the only one to hang for it. In the quarters, among the 47 souls who lived and labored on Whitmore's estate, there was a network of knowing, a conspiracy of silence that was itself an act of rebellion. They didn't speak of it directly, couldn't risk words even in whispers, but understanding passed between them in glances and small gestures, in the way old Moses, the stable hand, made sure the horses were locked up tight tonight so no master could flee quickly. In the way young Temperance, who served in the house, had developed a sudden illness this afternoon and been sent to the quarters, ensuring she wouldn't be present to serve dinner or become collateral damage. But there was one true accomplice, one soul who knew everything and had helped make it possible, a man named Isaiah who worked in Whitmore's library and had taught himself to read by candlelight, risking brutal punishment for the crime of literacy. Isaiah was 53, scarred across his back in patterns that told the story of every master he'd survived, and he loved Hannah with a devotion that was both fierce and hopeless. He'd loved her since she arrived 17 years ago, had never spoken it aloud because she belonged to the Colonel in ways that made love seem like foolishness. But after Grace died, after he'd helped Hannah dig that small grave and watched her soul calcify into something harder than diamond, his love transformed into partnership. Isaiah had obtained the arsenic, trading favors and taking enormous risks to acquire it in small amounts from sources in Charleston's underbelly. The apothecary's assistant, yes, but also a free black herbalist who understood what wasn't being said, and once dangerously from a white abolitionist sympathizer who asked too many questions but ultimately provided what was needed. Isaiah had also gathered intelligence, listening to the master's conversations while dusting bookshelves and pretending to be invisible, learning their schedules and plans, reporting back to Hannah in stolen moments behind the kitchen when night turned the world into a confederacy of shadows. Tonight, Isaiah waited in the barn with a wagon prepared and a map memorized, a route north that would take Hannah through swamps and forest, away from Charleston before dawn revealed what she'd done. At 8 o'clock precisely, Hannah entered the dining room carrying the oyster bisque on a silver tray, her face composed in the mask of servility she'd perfected over 17 years, eyes downcast, movements efficient, presence erased. The 6 men barely glanced at her. To them, she was animate furniture, a function rather than a person, and that invisibility had always been her greatest weapon. They were deep in conversation, voices loud with wine already consumed in the parlor, discussing the growing unrest in the northern colonies, the audacity of Boston's rebels, the Sons of Liberty who dared challenge British authority and, by extension, the entire hierarchy that kept men like them in power. "Treasonous dogs," Judge Drayton was saying as Hannah ladled bisque into his bowl, the creamy liquid steaming, fragrant with sherry and death. "They forget their place. Order must be maintained, by violence if necessary. You cannot permit the lower classes to question their betters. It spreads like disease." "Quite right," Reverend Gadsden agreed, waiting as Hannah filled his bowl, nodding his thanks without seeing her. Scripture is clear on this matter. Romans 13, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God." Rebellion against authority is rebellion against divine order itself. Hannah moved around the table with practiced grace, serving each man, her hands steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged and furious. She served Merchant Hayward, who was already calculating profits in his head, discussing a shipment expected from Barbados. She served Dutch Kraus, who was half drunk and telling a story about a runaway he'd caught and made an example of, describing the punishment with casual brutality that made the other men chuckle into their wine glasses. She served Dr. Pemberton, whose cold eyes flickered over her briefly, assessingly, as though she were a specimen he might find interesting to dissect someday. Colonel Whitmore raised his spoon. To civilization, gentlemen, to order, to the preservation of our way of life. The others echoed his toast, silver spoons glinting in candlelight as they dipped into poisoned bisque. Hannah stood against the wall, hands folded, waiting. The first spoonful crossed 6 pairs of lips simultaneously, a communion of the damned. The meal progressed with agonizing slowness, each course a station on the road to damnation. The bisque was consumed with appreciative murmurs, Judge Drayton complimenting the delicate balance of flavors, unaware that delicacy was the point, poison masked by culinary excellence. Hannah cleared the bowls and returned with turtle soup, the dark broth rich and complex, carrying its own measure of death. The men ate with the entitlement of those who'd never questioned whether their food was safe, who'd never had to wonder if the hands that fed them might also be the hands that would end them. 30 minutes in, she noticed the first signs. Merchant Hayward shifted uncomfortably in his chair, touching his stomach briefly before reaching for more wine, trying to wash away a discomfort he couldn't yet name. Reverend Gadsden's face had taken on a slight sheen of sweat despite the evening's relative coolness. These were subtle symptoms, easily dismissed, the body's early warnings before the real catastrophe began. Hannah brought out the main course, the roasted duck, its skin crackling and golden, the blackberry glaze gleaming like dark jewels in candlelight. This was the killing blow, though they wouldn't know it yet. "Hannah!" Colonel Whitmore called, his voice thick with satisfaction as she set the platter before him. "You've outdone yourself. This is magnificent." He carved into the duck, the meat falling away from the bone in perfect slices, pink and tender. He served his guests with the magnanimity of a king distributing favors, each man receiving a generous portion of their own destruction. They ate with enthusiasm, the conversation turning to politics again, to concerns about colonial resistance, about maintaining control over increasingly restive populations, both the rebelling colonists to the north and the enslaved Africans in their own households. The problem, Dr. Pemberton said, cutting into his duck with surgical precision, is that we've been too lenient. Mercy is mistaken for weakness. What's needed is a demonstration of absolute power, a reminder that consequences for disobedience are swift and total. He chewed thoughtfully, swallowed, reached for his wine. Hannah watched him drink, watched the arsenic slide down his throat like a judgment finally delivered. Otherwise, he continued, we risk losing everything we've built. By the time dessert arrived, the dining room had transformed from a temple of power into a chamber of creeping horror. Dutch Kraus was the first to truly suffer, his heavy drinking and voracious appetite accelerating the poison's work. He'd pushed back from the table 10 minutes earlier, face gone pale as candle wax, sweat pouring down his temples. Something's wrong, he muttered, then louder with rising panic. Something's wrong with me. His hands clutched at his stomach, and suddenly he doubled over, vomiting onto the imported Persian rug, his body convulsing as it tried desperately to expel what had already entered his bloodstream. The others stared, confusion turning to alarm. Judge Drayton attempted to stand, but his legs betrayed him and he collapsed back into his chair, his distinguished face contorting in pain. What is this? His voice, so accustomed to pronouncing judgment on others, now trembled with the vulnerability of a man facing his own sentence. Merchant Hayward's massive frame shook as cramps seized his intestines, the pain so intense he couldn't even cry out, could only gasp like a fish drowning in air. Dr. Pemberton's medical training became a curse rather than blessing. He recognized the symptoms even as he experienced them, understanding flooding his ice-blue eyes with terrible clarity. Poison, he gasped, looking wildly around the room until his gaze fixed on Hannah, who stood motionless by the sideboard, her face serene as a death mask. The food. He tried to rise, perhaps to reach her, perhaps to somehow purge his system or find an antidote, but his muscles refused coordination. He fell forward, scattering crystal glasses that shattered like breaking promises across the floor. Colonel Whitmore, still clinging to authority, even as it slipped through his fingers like water, turned to Hannah with comprehension dawning through his agony. "You've killed us," he said, not a question but a statement of impossible reality. "You've actually killed us." Hannah met his eyes for the first time in 17 years, not looking down, not away, but directly into the soul of a man who'd owned her body but never broken her spirit. "Yes," Hannah said simply, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of 17 years of silence finally broken. "I have." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, transforming the dining room into a courtroom where she was both judge and executioner. She took a step forward, no longer the invisible servant, but fully present, fully human, fully terrible in her righteousness. "For Grace, my daughter. 4 years old when your wife beat her to death while you locked me away. For Sarah, who hanged herself after your doctor violated her and called it science. For every soul you've bought and sold and broken and buried in unmarked graves. Reverend Gadsden, that holy man who'd blessed whipping posts and preached obedience, now whimpered as his body betrayed him, fluids leaking from every orifice, his digestive system disintegrating from the inside. God will damn you for this," he managed to choke out between spasms, still trying to wield theology as a weapon even as death wrapped its hands around his throat. "Then I'll see you in hell," Hannah replied without inflection, "and even there, you'll still owe me a debt you cannot pay." She looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces in extremis, witnessing their reduction from masters to merely mortal, merely men, merely meat succumbing to chemistry and consequence. Judge Drayton wept, tears cutting channels through the sweat on his face, crying for mercy he'd never granted. Merchant Hayward had fallen from his chair, crawling toward the door he'd never reach, leaving a trail of vomit and blood. Dutch Kraus lay still, his cruelty finally silenced, eyes open and unseeing. Colonel Whitmore tried one last time to assert dominance, his hand reaching for the bell that would summon help. But Hannah was faster. She swept the bell from the table, the silver ringing once, a death knell, before clattering across the floor. "No one is coming to save you," she said. "Tonight you answer for everything. Tonight the account is settled." And she stood there, bearing witness, as the men who'd claimed to own her choked on their own mortality and learned that some debts can only be paid in blood. Pause here with me, in this room where power dies and justice wears the face of a cook with poison on her hands. This is the moment history pretends doesn't exist, the instant when the oppressed become the reckoning, when silence transforms into thunder that shakes the foundations of empires built on stolen breath. If you're feeling that electricity in your spine, that dangerous recognition that some stories need to be told even when they terrify us, then you understand why this matters. Drop a comment below. Tell me you're here. Tell me you see Hannah standing in that candlelit room watching masters become corpses. Share this with someone who needs to know that resistance has always existed, that the powerless have always found ways to speak in languages the powerful finally understand. Subscribe if you want more histories they tried to bury, more voices they tried to silence, more truth served cold on silver platters. Because what happens next, how Hannah's act ignites a revolution, how her name becomes a whispered legend that terrifies slave owners from Charleston to Virginia, that's when this story transforms from murder into mythology. Hannah left them dying in their own filth and walked out of that house as though she were walking out of her own grave. The night air hit her face like baptism, humid and thick with the scent of magnolia and river water, and for the first time in 17 years she drew breath as something other than property. Behind her she could hear the distant sounds of agony, retching, moaning, the crash of furniture as bodies convulsed, but she didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had something to return to, and she had burned that bridge with arsenic and oleander, had severed every chain with poison precisely measured. Isaiah waited in the barn as promised, the wagon ready, a single horse already harnessed and stamping nervously as though it could smell the blood change in the air. He looked at her face and knew immediately that it was done, that the point of no return had been crossed and the only direction now was forward into darkness and uncertainty. "How long?" he asked, meaning how long before the bodies were discovered, before the alarm was raised, before the slave patrols and their dogs came hunting. "Dawn," Hannah said, climbing into the wagon. "Maybe sooner if the mistress checks on them. We have hours, not days." She'd already stripped off her kitchen clothes and wore now a simple traveling dress that Isaiah had stolen from a laundry line weeks ago, nondescript, forgettable, the uniform of invisibility. Her head was wrapped in dark cloth, her face smudged with ash to further obscure her features in the darkness. They moved through the property like ghosts, Isaiah driving the wagon slowly to avoid noise, taking the back path that led through the rice fields toward the swamp road. As they passed the magnolia tree where Grace was buried, Hannah placed her hand over her heart and whispered words only the dead could hear. Then they were beyond the estate's borders, on the public road heading north, two escaped slaves with a story that would set the South on fire, but first had to carry them through a gauntlet of checkpoints, patrols, and a legal system designed specifically to return them to chains or deliver them to nooses. Eleanor Whitmore discovered the massacre at 11:30 when the dinner had gone too long without her husband's customary summons to join the gentlemen for after-dinner conversation. She entered the dining room in her silk evening gown, a vision of plantation elegance, and found instead a scene from Revelation, 6 men in various stages of death and dying, the room reeking of vomit and excrement, candles still burning cheerfully as though nothing were wrong. Her scream shattered the night, brought the house slaves running, sent the entire estate into chaos that spread like wildfire through Charleston's elite districts. By midnight, doctors had been summoned and pronounced 5 men dead: Dutch Krause, Judge Drayton, Merchant Hayward, Reverend Gadsden, and Dr. Pemberton, that irony not lost on anyone, the physician unable to heal himself. Colonel Whitmore still clung to life, barely, his body racked with convulsions, his mind cycling between lucidity and delirium. In his clear moments, he rasped one word over and over: Hannah, the cook, the slave woman who'd fed them for 17 years. Gone. Vanished into the night along with the stable hand Isaiah, their quarters searched and found empty except for a small cloth bundle containing a child's dress, Grace's dress, left folded on Hannah's pallet like a confession or a declaration of war. The slave patrols were mobilized within the hour, dozens of armed white men on horseback with tracking dogs, fanning out across the countryside with orders to capture the fugitives alive, if possible, but dead if necessary. Rewards were posted: $500 for Hannah, $200 for Isaiah, astronomical sums that transformed every white person in the Carolinas into a potential bounty hunter and every black person into a potential victim of mistaken identity. The fury was biblical. This wasn't just murder, it was insurrection. It was the nightmare that kept slave owners awake at night, the fear that lived beneath every meal served by black hands, every moment of false civility and forced submission. If a cook could poison her masters, what was to stop every enslaved person from doing the same? The answer, they decided, had to be terror, spectacular, public, unforgettable terror. Hannah and Isaiah never made it to the northern states, though the legend would later claim they did. 3 days into their flight, exhausted and starving, they found refuge in a settlement of Maroons, escaped slaves who'd built a hidden community deep in the Great Dismal Swamp, a fortress of mud and cypress where white men's laws dissolved into mosquito-thick air and treacherous water. The Maroons knew Hannah's name before she spoke it. News traveled through the slave network faster than any writer, passed in coded songs and whispered messages, and what she'd done in Charleston had already become mythology. They welcomed her not as a fugitive but as a hero, as proof that resistance was possible, that masters could bleed. But Hannah's revolution had only begun. Within 2 weeks of the Charleston poisoning, 3 more incidents occurred across South Carolina and Georgia. Masters found dead at their dinner tables, household slaves vanished, arsenic traced in the remaining food. Then Virginia reported 2 cases, North Carolina 1. The pattern was unmistakable. Hannah had shown a method, had demonstrated that the invisible could become the lethal, that those who cooked the meals held the power of life and death. Plantation owners across the South faced a crisis of trust. Some dismissed their entire kitchen staffs, tried to hire white servants instead, but found few willing to work in the heat and degradation of Southern kitchens. Others installed guards to watch the cooks, created elaborate food tasting protocols, generated an atmosphere of paranoia that poisoned the master-slave relationship more thoroughly than any chemical compound. The colonial newspapers published hysterical editorials warning of a poison plot conspiracy, claiming organized networks of enslaved Africans were coordinating mass murder. Most of these claims were exaggerated, born of fear rather than fact, but the fear itself was revolutionary. For the first time, masters slept uneasily, looked at their property with suspicion, understood viscerally that the people they dehumanized were capable of intelligence, planning, and righteous vengeance. Some historians would later argue that this wave of poisonings, real and imagined, contributed to the paranoia that shaped the South's brutal response to slave resistance and influenced the region's trajectory towards civil war. Hannah lived free in the swamp for 9 months before the end came. The patrols never stopped searching, and in February of 1775, a bounty hunter with tracking dogs and a map, obtained through torture, finally penetrated the Maroon settlement. There was a brief, brutal firefight. The Maroons were armed and refused to surrender their own, and when the smoke cleared, Isaiah lay dead with 3 bullets in his chest, and Hannah stood over his body with an empty pistol in her hand and a choice before her. She could run deeper into the swamp, perhaps survive a while longer, or she could end it on her own terms. She chose a third option, surrender, but only to ensure the story survived. They dragged her back to Charleston in chains, displayed her in the public square like a trophy, and the trial was swift and theatrical. She was allowed no defense, no testimony beyond the simple question, "Did you poison your master and his guests?" Hannah's answer entered history. I did, and I would do it again. And if there is a God who judges righteously, he will weigh my 6 against your 6 million and find you wanting. The court sentenced her to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for March 15, 1775, to be carried out publicly as a warning to every enslaved person in the colonies. 10,000 people came to watch her die, the largest crowd Charleston had ever assembled. They expected her to beg, to repent, to provide the moral lesson that justified their system. Instead, Hannah walked to the gallows with her head high, her back straight, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found the faces of the enslaved who'd been forced to attend their own terrorization. To them, she smiled. To them, she nodded once, and her last words, shouted loud enough for everyone to hear before the rope went tight, were these: "Remember my name, remember what I did, and know that every meal you serve them could be your justice too." The trap door opened, her body dropped, and her legend was born in that terrible instant, spreading like fire through dry grass across every plantation in the South. Hannah became a ghost that haunted every Southern table for generations. Her name was whispered in slave quarters as both warning and inspiration, a story passed mother to daughter, father to son, in the coded language of survival and resistance. White families stopped speaking her name aloud, superstitiously believing that to invoke her was to invite her spirit into their kitchens. But they couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't shake the knowledge that she'd existed, that she'd acted, that she'd proven the fatal vulnerability at the heart of their system. Plantation mistresses began cooking their own meals or eating only food their husbands tasted first. Some masters freed their kitchen slaves, too terrified to keep them. Others increased brutality, hoping fear would prevent imitation, never understanding that fear was precisely what had created Hannah in the first place. Historians would debate her impact for centuries. Some claimed she was a footnote, an isolated incident inflated by paranoid imaginations. Others argued she represented a turning point, a moment when the enslaved demonstrated that total control was an illusion, that power could flow through unexpected channels, through kitchens and gardens, through knowledge of herbs and patience and the intimate access granted to those deemed too inferior to be dangerous. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between. Hannah didn't start the revolution, but she showed what form resistance could take when traditional rebellion was impossible. Her grave, if it exists, has never been found. They buried executed slaves in unmarked plots, refusing them even the dignity of remembrance. But Grace's grave, beneath that magnolia tree on Whitmore's estate, eventually received a marker. Not from the Whitmore family, who abandoned the property within a year, unable to live where 6 men had died screaming, but from others, from freed people after the Civil War, from descendants of the enslaved who remembered the story and honored both mother and daughter with a simple stone that read, "Grace and Hannah, they were here, they mattered, they won." Because in the end, Hannah did win, not the victory she'd imagined. She never escaped to freedom, never lived to see slavery abolished. But she'd claimed something no master could take from her: agency, choice, the power to say no more and make it true. She'd transformed from property to person to legend, and that legend carried forward through centuries, a reminder that resistance takes many forms. And justice, though delayed, sometimes arrives served cold on a silver platter by the hands that were never supposed to have the power to deliver it. Her story refuses to die because it speaks to something eternal: the hunger for dignity, the mathematics of oppression and consequence, and the truth that every empire built on stolen lives carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, waiting only for the right hands to cultivate them into poison, into fire, into freedom. The moon that watched her that night in May 1774 still rises over Charleston. And somewhere in its light, Hannah is still standing in that kitchen, grinding powder, choosing rebellion, becoming myth.